The dust on Kieran Dalton's boots was thick enough to plant seeds in when he spotted her swaying figure against the orange glow of the setting sun at the edge of Piñon, New Mexico territory. And something about the way she clutched her side told him this woman was either running from something or running toward hope. He pulled his horse to a halt, the leather reins creaking in his calloused hands as he studied her more carefully. She was young, maybe 23 or 24, with dark hair that had come loose from what must have been a proper bun hours ago. Her dress was torn at the hem and covered in trail dust, and when she looked up at him, her green eyes held a mixture of relief and wariness that made his chest tighten. "Miss," Kieran dismounted slowly, not wanting to spook her. He was 26 years old and had seen plenty of trouble in his years working cattle drives and keeping the peace when needed, but something about this woman made him move with extra caution. "You all right?" She took a step toward him and stumbled. Kieran caught her before she hit the ground, and up close he could see the exhaustion etched into her pretty features. Her lips were cracked from the sun, and her hands were scraped raw. "I wasn't sure I'd make it here," she whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. I walked so far." Kieran steadied her, supporting most of her weight as she sagged against him. "Where did you come from?" "Santa Fe," she managed, and his eyes widened. "That was nearly 60 miles north, much of it through rough country. Had to leave, had to get away." "Let's get you some water first, then we can talk." Kieran guided her to his horse and retrieved his canteen. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin, and he had to pull it away gently. "Easy now. Too much at once will make you sick." She nodded, wiping her mouth with a trembling hand. "Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not usually like this." "No need to apologize for being human." Kieran glanced toward the town, where the first evening lights were beginning to glow in windows. "Can you ride? My horse can carry us both into town. There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Chen. She's good people, and she won't ask too many questions if you're not ready to answer them." The woman looked up at him with those striking green eyes, and he saw her weighing her options. Trust a stranger or collapse here on the outskirts of town. "What's your name?" she asked. "Kieran Dalton. I work the Double R Ranch just outside of town, but I come into Piñon most evenings." He offered her a small smile. "I promise I mean you no harm. I've got a sister back in Texas, and I'd hope someone would help her if she was in trouble." Something in his words seemed to reach her because she nodded. Katherine Foster, and yes, I can ride, though I might need help getting up there." Kieran helped Katherine onto his horse, then swung up behind her. She was so light in his arms, and he could feel how her whole body trembled with exhaustion. As they rode into Piñon, he found himself wondering what could drive a woman to walk 60 miles through dangerous territory. The year was 1878, and the New Mexico territory was still wild enough that a woman alone faced threats from outlaws, wildlife, and the harsh land itself. The boarding house was a sturdy adobe structure near the center of town, its thick walls keeping it cool even in the heat of summer. Kieran dismounted and helped Katherine down, keeping a steadying arm around her waist as they climbed the steps to the front door. Mrs. Chen answered on the second knock, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile when she saw Kieran, then shifting to concern when she noticed Katherine. "Oh my. Bring her in, bring her in. She needs a room, Mrs. Chen, and probably a meal and a bath if you can spare it." "Of course." Mrs. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who had come west with her late husband during the railroad construction years, ushered them inside. She had faced her own share of hardship and prejudice, but she had persevered and built a respectable business in Piñon. "Come, dear. Let's get you settled." Kieran helped Katherine to a chair in the small parlor while Mrs. Chen bustled away to prepare a room. Catherine's eyes drifted closed and he worried she might faint again. "Katherine, stay with me a moment." He knelt beside her chair. "Is someone following you? Am I putting Mrs. Chen in danger by bringing you here?" Her eyes snapped open and he saw fear flicker across her face before she shook her head. "No, no one's following me. He doesn't know where I went. He probably thinks I'm dead by now." Catherine's jaw tightened. "My husband, or the man who claimed to be my husband." "The marriage wasn't legal, I found out. He already had a wife back in Missouri." Her voice cracked. "When I confronted him, he didn't take it well, so I left. I took what money I'd saved and I left." Kieran felt anger simmer in his chest, but he kept his voice gentle. "You're safe now. Piñon might be small, but we look after our own. If he comes looking, he'll find a town that doesn't take kindly to men who hurt women." Mrs. Chen returned and led Katherine upstairs, leaving Kieran alone in the parlor. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the worn floorboards and trying to understand why this stranger's pain affected him so deeply. He'd helped plenty of people over the years. That was just what decent folk did. But something about Katherine Foster had lodged itself under his skin in the space of half an hour. He left money with Mrs. Chen for Katherine's room and board for a week, ignoring the older woman's knowing look, and headed back out into the warm evening. His horse needed tending, and he needed to think. The next morning, Kieran found himself riding into town earlier than usual. He told himself it was to check on Katherine, to make sure she'd survived the night and hadn't taken a turn for the worse. He told himself it was simple Christian charity and nothing more. Mrs. Chen answered the door with a cup of tea in her hand and amusement dancing in her dark eyes. "She's in the kitchen, eating breakfast. Go on back." Katherine looked better. Her face was clean, her hair was properly pinned, and she wore a simple dress that Mrs. Chen must have loaned her. The dress was slightly too short, showing her ankles, but it was clean and whole. She looked up when Kieran entered and color rose in her cheeks. "Mr. Dalton, I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me. Just Kieran, please." He took off his hat and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, tired, but better." She pushed a piece of bread around her plate. "Mrs. Chen told me you paid for my room. That's too generous. I have some money. Not much, but enough to cover my own way for a while. Keep your money. You'll need it to get established here." Kieran accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Chen, who then discreetly left them alone. "What are your plans? Will you stay in Piñon?" Katherine's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her own cup. "I don't know. I need to find work, but I'm not sure what's available in a town this size. I was a seamstress in Santa Fe, a good one, but I don't know if Piñon needs another seamstress." "Actually, old Mrs. Murphy, who did most of the mending, died last winter. The nearest seamstress now is in Las Vegas, which is a hard day's ride from here. If you're truly skilled, you'd have customers." Hope flickered across Katherine's face. "Really? I'd need to see about setting up somewhere, finding a space to work. There's an empty shop on Main Street. Nothing fancy, but it has good light. The owner is a friend of mine. I could introduce you." For the first time since he'd found her, Katherine smiled. It transformed her whole face, making her beautiful in a way that made Kieran's breath catch. "You've been so kind to me. I don't know how to repay you." "No repayment needed." Kieran shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of how intently she was looking at him. "I meant what I said yesterday. It's what decent people do." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Katherine spoke again. "Can I ask you something? Yesterday you mentioned a sister in Texas. Do you have family here?" "No. My sister Sarah is married to a rancher outside of Dallas. My parents passed when I was young. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Sarah and I made our own way for a while, then she met Thomas and I drifted west." Kieran stared into his coffee. I like it out here. The land is hard, but it's honest. You know where you stand. I envy that certainty. Katherine's voice was soft. I thought I knew where I stood. I thought I was building a life with a good man, finding out it was all lies, that he was lying to me and his real wife and probably others. It shattered something inside me. Not everything is broken just because one man was a liar. Kieran reached across the table and gently touched her hand. You'll heal. It takes time, but you will. Katherine looked down at his hand covering hers, and something passed between them. Something electric and terrifying and wonderful all at once. She didn't pull away, and Kieran didn't either. Over the following weeks, Kieran found himself spending more and more time in Piñon. He helped Katherine clean out the shop space, fixed the broken shutters, and introduced her to everyone in town. She proved to be as skilled as she'd claimed, and word spread quickly. Soon, she had steady work mending clothes, making dresses for the few women in town who could afford new ones, and even taking on the occasional order for the ranch hands who wanted their Sunday shirts repaired properly. Kieran watched her confidence return day by day. The haunted look in her eyes gradually faded, replaced by something calmer. She laughed more easily, joked with customers, and began to make real friends in town. And through it all, Kieran found reasons to stop by her shop. Sometimes he brought her lunch. Sometimes he had legitimate mending that needed doing. Sometimes he just wanted to see her. You're courting her, said Frank Richards, the foreman at the Double R Ranch, one evening as they checked the fence line. Just admit it. Kieran tightened a wire with more force than necessary. I'm being neighborly. You rode into town 4 times this week. That's not neighborly, that's courting. Frank grinned. Not that I blame you. She's pretty, and from what I hear, she's got a good head on her shoulders. But maybe you should make your intentions clear before some other fellow decides to try his luck. The thought of another man courting Katherine sent an unexpected spike of jealousy through Kieran's chest. She's been through a lot. I don't want to push. There's a difference between pushing and being honest. Frank wiped sweat from his brow. Women appreciate knowing where they stand, same as men. That night, Kieran lay awake in his bunk at the ranch, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Katherine. When had his concern for her welfare turned into something deeper? He thought about her smile, the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating on a particularly difficult stitch, the sound of her laugh when something genuinely delighted her. He thought about how his whole day felt brighter after spending time in her presence. He was falling in love with her. Maybe he'd been falling since the moment he found her at the edge of town, desperate and brave and refusing to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. The next Sunday, Kieran worked up the courage to ask Katherine to join him for a picnic. To his relief and delight, she agreed. They rode out to a spot Kieran knew along the Pecos River, where cottonwood trees provided shade and the water ran clear and cool. Katherine had packed food from the boarding house, and they spread a blanket on the grassy bank. "This is beautiful," Katherine said, looking out at the water. "I haven't taken time to just enjoy the land since I got here. I've been so focused on building the business. And you've done well. Everyone says you're the best seamstress they've ever had." Kieran poured them both lemonade from the jar Katherine had brought. "You should be proud." "I am. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm building something real, something that's mine." Katherine turned to look at him, and her expression was serious. "And a lot of that is because of you, Kieran. You gave me a chance when I had nothing. You believed in me. You did the hard work. I just opened a door. It was more than that." Katherine reached out and took his hand, just as he had taken hers that first morning in Mrs. Chen's kitchen. "You made me feel safe. You made me feel like I could trust again, even though I'd sworn I never would. That's no small thing." Kieran's heart pounded. "Katherine, I need to be honest with you about something. My intentions aren't purely neighborly anymore, haven't been for a while now." He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "I care for you deeply, and if you'll allow it, I'd like to court you properly. No pressure, no expectations, just the chance to see where this might lead." Katherine's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling. "I was hoping you'd say something. I've been feeling the same way, but I wasn't sure if you just saw me as some broken thing you'd rescued. I wasn't sure if you could want me, knowing my history. Your history is what makes you strong. You survived something that would have destroyed a weaker person. You walked 60 miles through hostile territory rather than stay in a situation that wasn't right. That's not broken. That's brave." Kieran squeezed her hand. "And yes, I want you. I want the chance to know everything about you, to make you smile, to be the person you turn to when things are hard." Katherine laughed and cried at the same time, and then she was leaning forward and kissing him. It was soft and sweet and tasted like lemonade and new beginnings. When they pulled apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "So, is that a yes?" Kieran asked. "That's definitely a yes." They spent the rest of the afternoon by the river, talking about everything and nothing. Katherine told him about growing up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a clerk. She told him about learning to sew from her grandmother, about the way fabric and thread could be transformed into something beautiful and useful. She told him about the dreams she'd had before coming west, and the new dreams she was building now. Kieran told her about his childhood in Texas, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the grief of losing his parents and the responsibility of helping raise his younger sister. He told her about the satisfaction of hard work, the peace he found in the vast New Mexico landscape, and the loneliness he hadn't fully acknowledged until she came into his life. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Kieran helped Katherine pack up their picnic. Before they mounted the horses for the ride back, he pulled her close and kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the moment. "I meant what I said," he murmured against her hair. "I'll court you proper, I'll do this right. I know you will." Katherine pulled back to look at him, her green eyes warm. "That's one of the many things I love about you." The words hung in the air between them, bold and honest. It was early to speak of love, Kieran knew, but he also knew it was true. He loved her. He'd fallen completely and thoroughly in love with Katherine Foster, and the wonder in her eyes told him she felt the same way. The courtship that followed was the talk of Piñon, though in the kindest way possible. People were genuinely happy to see Katherine finding joy after arriving in town in such dire circumstances. They approved of Kieran, who was known as a hard worker and a decent man. On Sundays after church, Kieran and Katherine would walk together, his arm linked with hers. He attended the occasional town social with her, and she came to watch when he competed in the ranch's roping competitions. 3 months after that first picnic, Kieran took Katherine to dinner at the town's small restaurant. It wasn't fancy by city standards, but it was the nicest place in Piñon. Over steaks and potatoes, Kieran felt his nerve building. "Katherine, there's something I want to ask you." She looked up from her plate, a slight smile playing at her lips. "I'm listening." Kieran reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a single small diamond. It had belonged to his mother, the only thing of value his parents had owned. "I know it's not been a long time by society's standards, but out here, time moves different. We know what we know and we feel what we feel." He opened the box, showing her the ring. "Katherine Foster, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" Katherine's hand flew to her mouth and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Kieran, yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you." She let him slip the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. "I love you. I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I love you too. I think I loved you from the moment I found you at the edge of town, trying so hard to be brave." Kieran stood and pulled her to her feet, kissing her right there in the restaurant while the few other diners clapped and cheered. They were married a month later in the small church in Piñon. Mrs. Chen helped Katherine make her wedding dress, a beautiful creation of ivory silk that had been ordered specially from Santa Fe. Sarah made the journey from Texas with her husband Thomas and their 2 children, and Kieran felt his heart swell to have his sister there to witness his happiness. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, and afterwards there was a celebration with music and dancing that lasted well into the night. Kieran had spent the previous weeks building an addition onto his small cabin at the ranch, creating a proper home for his bride. It wasn't much, but it had a real bedroom, a kitchen with a good stove, and a spacious room where Katherine could work on her sewing projects. He'd even built her a special table with excellent light from the south-facing windows. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous and excited in equal measure. Katherine had been honest with Kieran about her previous relationship, and he had been patient and understanding, never pressing her for more than she was ready to give. Now, as man and wife, they came together with love and trust, and afterwards Katherine cried happy tears against his chest. "I never thought I'd feel safe enough to trust someone this completely," she whispered. "But with you it feels right. It feels like home." "You are my home," Kieran replied, holding her close. "Wherever you are, that's where I belong." Their first year of marriage was full of adjustments and joys. Katherine continued her seamstress work, though she moved her operation to their cabin, which was closer to the ranch where Kieran worked. She took on larger projects, making entire wardrobes for the ranch owner's family, and even creating a set of elaborate curtains for the church. Her reputation spread beyond Piñon, and occasionally people would make the journey from Las Vegas or even Santa Fe to commission work from her. Kieran found himself working harder than ever, driven by the desire to provide well for his wife and the family they hoped to have someday. The ranch owner, seeing his dedication, promoted him to assistant foreman, which came with better pay and more responsibility. In the evenings, he and Katherine would sit on their small porch, watching the sun set over the vast New Mexico landscape, and talk about their dreams for the future. One evening in early spring, as they sat in their usual spot, Katherine took his hand and placed it on her belly. "I have something to tell you. We're going to have a baby." Kieran felt his whole world shift and expand. "A baby? Are you certain?" "Very certain. Mrs. Chen helped me confirm it. The baby should come in the fall, probably October." Katherine's eyes sparkled with happiness and a touch of fear. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased." Kieran pulled her into his arms, careful not to squeeze too tight. "Katherine, I'm beyond pleased. I'm overjoyed. We're going to have a family." The pregnancy progressed well, though the summer heat made Katherine uncomfortable. Kieran doted on her, bringing her cool water, making sure she rested enough, and generally worrying over her like a mother hen. She bore his fussing with good humor, even as she assured him she was perfectly healthy and women had been having babies since the dawn of time. In early October, as the air finally began to cool and the cottonwoods turned golden, Katherine's labor began. Mrs. Chen and 2 other women from town came to help, shooing Kieran outside while they attended to his wife. He paced the yard for hours, listening to Katherine's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Frank stayed with him, offering whiskey and pointless reassurances that everything would be fine. When the sun was just beginning to set, Kieran heard a new sound, the sharp, angry cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Mr. Dalton, a healthy, strong boy, and your wife is well, though very tired." Kieran pushed past her into the bedroom where Katherine lay propped up on pillows, sweaty and exhausted and absolutely beautiful. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in soft blankets. When she looked up at him, her smile was radiant. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Kieran approached the bed like he was approaching something holy. Katherine shifted the baby so he could see the tiny face, red and wrinkled and utterly perfect. "He's beautiful," Kieran breathed. "He's absolutely beautiful." "Do you want to hold him?" Kieran nodded, and Katherine carefully placed the baby in his arms. The weight of his son, the warm, solid reality of this new life, brought tears to Kieran's eyes. "Hello, little one. I'm your papa, and I promise I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe and happy." "What should we name him?" Katherine asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but nothing had felt quite right until now. Kieran looked down at his son, who had settled quietly in his arms, and suddenly he knew. "Kenneth, after my father, Kenneth Dalton," Katherine smiled. "Kenneth, I like it. Hello, Kenneth." Welcome to the world. The first months with baby Kenneth were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he still needed constant care. Katherine recovered from the birth quickly, and she balanced caring for the baby with taking on smaller sewing projects. Kieran helped whenever he could, changing nappies and walking the floor with Kenneth when he was fussy in the evenings. On Kenneth's first Christmas, the little family gathered around their fireplace while snow fell softly outside. Kenneth was 3 months old, too young to understand the celebration, but delighting everyone with his coos and gurgles. Kieran had carved a small wooden horse for his son, even though it would be years before Kenneth could properly play with it. Katherine had made new shirts for Kieran and a beautiful quilt for their bed. "This is everything I ever wanted," Katherine said that night as they lay together in bed, Kenneth asleep in his cradle nearby. "A real home, a real family, someone who truly loves me. There were times during that walk from Santa Fe when I thought I'd never have any of this. I thought I'd die alone in the desert. But you didn't. You made it. You survived and you built a new life, and now we have all of this." Kieran pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "You're the strongest person I know, Katherine. And I fall more in love with you every single day. I love you too, more than words can say." The years that followed were good ones. Kenneth grew into a bright, energetic boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. When he was 3, Katherine became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was harder. She was more tired, more uncomfortable, and Kieran worried constantly. But in the spring of 1883, she delivered a healthy baby girl. They named her Kathleen after Katherine, and she was as different from her brother as night from day. Where Kenneth had been calm and easy, Kathleen was demanding and fussy. But she was also beautiful, with her father's dark eyes and a head of soft blonde hair that seemed to come from nowhere until Katherine remembered that her own grandmother had been blonde. With 2 young children, life became more complicated. Katherine had to cut back on her sewing work, focusing only on her most reliable customers. Kieran took on extra work when he could, determined to ensure his family wanted for nothing. They added another room to the cabin, giving Kenneth his own space as he got older. The summer Kenneth turned 6. A man came through Piñon asking questions about a woman named Katherine Foster. Kieran was in town when he heard about it, and his blood ran cold. He found the man at the saloon, a well-dressed gentleman in his 40s who was showing people a photograph. "Can I help you with something?" Kieran asked, his voice calm but his muscles tense. The man looked up. I'm looking for a woman. Katherine Foster, this is her." He held out the photograph, and sure enough, it was Katherine's face staring back at Kieran, though younger and sadder than the woman he knew now. "What do you want with her? Are you the law?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Because if you're not, it's none of your business." "My name's Kieran Dalton." "Katherine Foster is my wife, so I'd say it's very much my business." The man's expression shifted from suspicion to something like relief. "Your wife? Then she's alive. Thank God." He extended his hand. "I'm Robert Foster, Katherine's older brother. I've been looking for her for 5 years." Kieran's tension eased slightly, but he didn't fully relax. "Why don't we go somewhere more private to talk?" They went to Katherine's old shop, which was now being used by a cobbler but still had a small back room. There, Robert explained that after Katherine had disappeared from Santa Fe, he'd hired investigators to try to find her. He'd learned about the man Katherine had married, about his lies and his violence, and Robert had feared the worst. "I thought he'd killed her," Robert said, his voice rough with emotion. "When she vanished without a trace, I was certain she was dead. I've been traveling through every town in the territory, showing her picture, hoping against hope to find her alive." Kieran studied the man carefully. He seemed genuinely emotional, genuinely relieved. "She walked to Piñon from Santa Fe, nearly 60 miles through rough country. I found her at the edge of town, half dead from exhaustion." Robert closed his eyes. "That sounds like Katherine, stubborn as hell and twice as brave." He looked at Kieran. "Will you take me to her? I swear I mean her no harm. I just want to see my sister again. Wait here. I'll bring her to town." Kieran didn't fully trust this stranger, even if he was Katherine's brother. He wanted to prepare Katherine to make sure she wanted this reunion. When Kieran explained the situation to Katherine back at the cabin, her reaction was complex. Shock, joy, fear, and anger all crossed her face in quick succession. "Robert is here. After all this time." She sank into a chair, one hand pressed to her chest. "I thought he must have given up on me." "I thought everyone had. He never stopped looking for you." Kieran knelt beside her chair. "Do you want to see him? If you don't, I'll send him away. You're my wife, and your wishes come first." Katherine was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "I want to see him. He's my only family besides you and the children. But Kieran, will you stay with me? I don't want to face this alone." "Of course. Always." The reunion between Katherine and Robert was tearful and emotional. Robert hugged his sister for a long time, apologizing for not finding her sooner, for not protecting her from the man who had hurt her. Katherine cried and reassured him that none of it was his fault, that she had made her own choices, both good and bad. Robert spent a week in Piñon, getting to know Kieran and meeting his niece and nephew. He was a banker in St. Louis, successful and respectable, and he urged Katherine to come back east with her family. "You could have a better life there," he said over dinner one evening. "The children could go to good schools. Kieran could find steady work that doesn't require breaking his back every day." But Katherine shook her head. "This is our life, Robert. This is where we belong. Piñon might be small, and the territory might still be rough around the edges, but this is our home. These are our people. We're not leaving." Kieran reached over and squeezed Katherine's hand, grateful for her words. He had no desire to leave New Mexico, to trade the wide open spaces for city streets. And clearly, neither did Katherine, when Robert finally left to return to St. Louis. He extracted a promise that Katherine would write regularly and that she would bring the family to visit when the children were older. He left them with a generous sum of money, which Kieran was reluctant to accept, but Katherine insisted they take. "He's trying to help," she said. "Let him. He feels guilty for not being there when I needed him. This is his way of making it right." They used the money to buy a small herd of cattle, establishing their own ranch adjacent to the Double R. It wasn't much at first, just 20 head, but it was a start. Kieran continued working at the Double R while building up their own operation, and slowly but surely they prospered. Kenneth and Kathleen grew up strong and healthy, learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk. Kenneth was quiet and thoughtful, with a love for animals that made him a natural rancher. Kathleen was bold and outspoken, always climbing trees and getting into mischief, but smart as a whip. Katherine schooled them at home, using the education her father had given her to teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. Kieran taught them about the land, about cattle, about the skills they'd need to survive and thrive in New Mexico. As the children grew older, the story of how their parents met became a favorite family tale. Kenneth and Kathleen would beg to hear it again and again. How Papa had found Mama at the edge of town, how she had been so brave walking all that way, how they fell in love and built a life together. "You saved Mama," Kathleen said one evening when she was 8, looking up at her father with adoring eyes. But Kieran shook his head. "No, sweetheart, your Mama saved herself. I just helped her along the way." "We saved each other," Katherine corrected, smiling at her husband across the dinner table. "That's what people who love each other do." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kieran surprised Katherine with a trip to Santa Fe. They left the children with Mrs. Chen and made the journey together, this time in a comfortable wagon with plenty of supplies. When they reached the city where Katherine had once lived in fear and desperation, she was amazed at how different it felt. "It doesn't have any power over me anymore," she said as they walked through the plaza. "This is just a place. It's not my nightmare anymore." They stayed in a nice hotel, ate at fancy restaurants, and Kieran bought Katherine a beautiful necklace that he'd been saving up for. But the highlight of the trip was simply being together, remembering where they'd come from and celebrating where they were now. "Did you ever imagine this?" Katherine asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. "That day when you found me, did you imagine we'd end up here?" Kieran thought about it. "Honestly, no. I thought I was just helping a stranger in need. I had no idea that stranger would become the center of my entire world." He pulled her close. "But I'm grateful for every moment. Even the hard ones, because they brought us here. I love you, Kieran Dalton. I loved you then, and I love you now, and I'll love you until the day I die. And I love you, Katherine Dalton, forever and always." The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and triumphs. There was the drought of 1885 that nearly wiped out their cattle herd, but they survived by selling off some of their land and tightening their belts. There was the influenza outbreak that swept through Piñon in 1887, sparing their family but taking several friends, including old Frank Richards. There was Kenneth's broken arm from falling off a horse, and Kathleen's near drowning in the Pecos that Kieran pulled her from just in time. But there were also birthdays and holidays, christenings and weddings as their children grew up. Kenneth turned into a handsome young man who took over most of the ranch work as Kieran got older. At 21, he married a sweet girl named Emma from a neighboring ranch, and within a year, they made Kieran and Katherine grandparents to a baby girl. Kathleen proved too spirited for ranch life. At 18, she announced she wanted to be a teacher like her grandfather had been. She went to Las Vegas to attend normal school, and eventually she secured a position teaching in Piñon, staying close to her family but pursuing her own dreams. Katherine's hair began to turn gray in her 40s, and Kieran found he loved her silver threads as much as he'd loved her dark hair. His own hair was more salt than pepper now, and his body ached in the mornings from decades of hard work. But when he looked at Katherine across the breakfast table, or caught her eye during church services, He felt the same flutter in his chest that he'd felt when he first kissed her by the Pecos River all those years ago. On a warm summer evening when Kieran was 52 and Katherine was 49, they sat on their porch watching Kenneth and Emma's 3 children playing in the yard. Their second grandchild, a boy named after Kieran, was teaching his younger sisters how to skip stones. "We built something good here," Katherine said, her hand in Kieran's. "Against all odds, we built something that will last long after we're gone." "We did it together," Kieran replied. "That's what made it possible." Katherine leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day? I wasn't sure I'd make it here. I was talking about making it to Piñon, but it meant so much more than that. I wasn't sure I'd make it to a place where I could be happy again, where I could trust again, where I could love again. And then there you were. I'll always be here, right beside you until the end." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. The grandchildren's laughter rang out across the land, mixing with the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, and the gentle evening breeze rustling through the cottonwoods. This was their legacy. A family built on love and trust, a ranch carved from hard work and determination, a life that had started with a desperate woman at the edge of town and a cowboy who stopped to help. Katherine thought back to that terrible walk from Santa Fe, when every step had been agony and she'd been certain she wouldn't survive. She thought about the moment she'd seen Kieran riding toward her, backlit by the setting sun, and how she'd known with sudden certainty that if she could just make it to him, everything might be all right. She had been right. 25 years after Kieran found Katherine at the edge of town, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary with a huge gathering at the ranch. All of their friends and family came. Robert traveled from St. Louis with his wife and children. Sarah and Thomas made the journey from Texas, and what felt like half of Piñon showed up to celebrate with them. There was dancing and music and more food than any army could eat. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and only family remained, Kenneth raised a glass to toast his parents. "To Mama and Papa," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You taught us what real love looks like. You taught us that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth building slowly and carefully over decades. You gave us roots and wings, security and freedom. We are who we are because of your love for each other and for us." Everyone raised their glasses and Katherine felt tears streaming down her face. Kieran pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "We're the lucky ones," he whispered to her. "To have found each other, to have had all this time together. We're the luckiest people in the world." As the night grew late and the grandchildren finally fell asleep on blankets spread across the floor, Kieran and Katherine retired to their bedroom. They held each other close, two people who had started as strangers and become partners, lovers, parents, grandparents, and best friends. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't ridden by that evening?" Katherine asked. "If you'd stayed at the ranch or taken a different route into town?" "Sometimes. But I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Kieran stroked her hair gently. "You were meant to make it to Piñon, and I was meant to be there when you did. Everything else just followed from that." "I wasn't sure I'd make it here," Katherine murmured, echoing her words from that first day. "But I did, and it was worth every painful step." The years that followed their silver anniversary were quieter. Kieran and Katherine gradually handed over more and more of the ranch operations to Kenneth and Emma, content to spend their days in simpler pursuits. Katherine returned to her sewing, making elaborate quilts for each of her grandchildren, and taking on the occasional special project just to keep her skills sharp. Kieran spent his time mentoring the younger ranch hands, reading the books Katherine had always encouraged him to enjoy, and sitting on the porch watching the sun set over land they owned free and clear. More grandchildren arrived. Kenneth and Emma had 2 more babies, making 5 in total. Kathleen married a fellow teacher named Michael, and they had twin boys who kept everyone entertained with their antics. The house that had once been so quiet was now filled with the sound of children whenever the family gathered, which was often. On Kieran's 60th birthday, the whole family gathered for a celebration. His children and grandchildren surrounded him, and Katherine sat beside him with her hand in his, just as she had for 32 years of marriage. Looking around at all the faces, Kieran felt a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Thank you all for being here, for being part of this family. You are the greatest gift of my life, second only to your mother and grandmother." He looked at Katherine. "Everything good I have, everything that matters started with her." Katherine squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears. "And everything I have started with you stopping to help a stranger. One act of kindness changed both our lives forever." As the celebration continued around them, Katherine leaned close to Kieran and whispered, "If I could go back and do it all again, knowing everything that would happen, I'd still make that walk from Santa Fe. I'd walk 1,000 miles to get to you. And I'd always be there at the edge of town, waiting to find you." They kissed, soft and sweet, 2 people who had loved each other through decades of hardship and joy, who had built a life and a family from nothing but determination and devotion. The children and grandchildren cheered and clapped, celebrating not just a birthday but a love story that had become the foundation of their entire family. When Katherine was 64 and Kieran was 67, Katherine's health began to decline. It started small, a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, then progressed to fatigue and weakness. The doctor in Piñon did what he could, but medicine was limited in the small town. Eventually, they made the difficult journey to Santa Fe to see a specialist. The diagnosis was consumption, tuberculosis, and there was little that could be done. The doctor gave Katherine perhaps a year, maybe 2 if she was lucky and rested as much as possible. Kieran felt his world tilting. No, there has to be something, some treatment. But the doctor shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dalton. Make the most of the time you have left together." They returned to Piñon, and Kieran found himself once again tending to Katherine, just as he had in those early days when he'd found her exhausted and desperate at the edge of town. But this time, he couldn't fix things. He couldn't save her. Katherine faced her diagnosis with the same courage she'd shown throughout her life. "I'm not afraid," she told Kieran one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "I've had a good life, a full life. More than I ever dreamed possible that day I walked into Piñon. I have no regrets. I'm not ready to lose you." Kieran's voice broke. "I don't know how to be in this world without you. You'll never be without me. I'll always be with you in your heart, in our children and grandchildren, in this land we built together." Katherine took his face in her hands. "Promise me you'll keep living, really living after I'm gone. Don't just exist. Keep loving life the way we've loved it together." "I promise," Kieran whispered, though he couldn't imagine how he would keep that promise. Katherine lived longer than the doctor predicted, making it through another winter and into the spring. She rallied enough to attend Kathleen's twin boys' 10th birthday party, to hold her newest great-grandchild, Kenneth's first grandchild, through his oldest daughter. She spent hours telling stories to the children, making sure they knew their family history, making sure they understood where they came from. On a gentle April evening, with Kieran holding her hand and all their children gathered around, Katherine passed peacefully in her sleep. She was 65 years old, and she had been married to Kieran for 37 years. The funeral was attended by everyone in Piñon and many people from surrounding areas. Katherine had touched countless lives with her kindness, her skill, her quiet strength. They buried her in the small cemetery on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Katherine Foster Dalton, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother. She made it." Kieran felt like half of himself had been buried with her. For weeks, he moved through life in a daze, going through the motions but feeling nothing. Kenneth and Kathleen took turns staying with him, worried about their father's grief. But slowly, very slowly, Kieran began to heal. He remembered his promise to Katherine, and he determined to honor it. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them to ride and rope, and all the skills his own father had taught him. He attended church every Sunday and sat in the pew he and Katherine had shared, feeling her presence beside him. He kept the ranch running smoothly, taking pride in the legacy they had built together. And every evening he sat on the porch and watched the sunset, telling Katherine about his day, feeling her listening even though she was gone. 3 years after Katherine's death, Kieran was 70 years old and beginning to slow down considerably. His health was declining, his heart growing weaker. The doctor said it was just age, just the natural progression of a life well lived and hard worked. Kieran didn't fight it. He was tired, and he missed Katherine with an ache that had never diminished. On a warm summer evening, Kenneth found his father on the porch, sitting in his usual chair with his eyes closed and a peaceful smile on his face. Kieran had passed quietly, without pain, slipping away to join the woman he had loved for more than 40 years. They buried him beside Katherine on the hill, with a headstone that matched hers. Kieran Dalton, beloved husband, father, and grandfather, he was always there. In the years that followed, Kenneth and Emma ran the ranch with the same dedication and love that Kieran and Katherine had shown. They made sure their children and grandchildren knew the story of how Grandma Katherine had walked 60 miles through dangerous territory, how Grandpa Kieran had found her at the edge of Piñon and offered help without hesitation, how that one moment of kindness had blossomed into a love that spanned decades and created a family legacy. The town of Piñon grew and changed over the years, but the Dalton Ranch remained, passed down through generations. And on the hill overlooking the ranch, 2 graves sat side by side, the final resting place of a cowboy who stopped to help a stranger, and a woman who had the courage to walk toward hope when everything seemed lost. Their love story became legend in Piñon, told and retold around dinner tables and at town gatherings. Young couples would visit their graves before their own weddings, hoping to find a love as true and lasting as what Kieran and Katherine had shared. The story of Katherine's desperate walk and Kieran's compassionate response became a reminder that even in the hardest times, kindness and courage could create something beautiful. Kathleen, who became a renowned educator in New Mexico territory, wrote a book in her later years documenting her parents' love story and the history of their family. In the introduction, she wrote, "My mother once told me that she wasn't sure she would make it to Piñon that day she walked from Santa Fe, but she did make it because giving up wasn't in her nature. And when she arrived, exhausted and desperate, my father was there, as if fate had placed him exactly where he needed to be." Their love was built on a foundation of kindness, respect, and unwavering devotion. In a time and place where life was often brutal and short, they created something gentle and enduring. This is their story, but it's also the story of every person who has ever chosen compassion over indifference, who has ever had the courage to start over, who has ever believed that love can heal even the deepest wounds. The book became required reading in schools throughout New Mexico, teaching new generations about the early days of the territory and the power of love to transform lives. Kathleen lived to see New Mexico achieve statehood in 1912, and she always credited her parents' generation with taming the wild territory and building communities based on cooperation and mutual respect. Kenneth followed his father's path, becoming a respected rancher and community leader. He served as mayor of Piñon for 12 years, always making decisions based on the values his parents had instilled in him: fairness, hard work, and compassion for those in need. He and Emma had a marriage that lasted 53 years, and their children often said they modeled their relationship after Grandma Katherine and Grandpa Kieran. The Dalton Ranch prospered through good times and bad, surviving droughts, economic depressions, and the changing nature of ranching as the 20th century progressed. But through it all, the family maintained the values that Kieran and Katherine had established: work hard, treat people fairly, help those in need, and never take for granted the love of family. By the time the ranch celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1979, there were Daltons spread across New Mexico and beyond, but many came back to Piñon for the celebration. The house where Kieran and Katherine had raised their family was now a beloved family museum, maintained carefully and filled with artifacts from the early days: Katherine's sewing tools, Kieran's saddle, photographs from their wedding day, and letters they had written to each other during the few times they were separated. The oldest member of the family present was Kenneth's daughter Martha, who was 94 years old. She stood at her grandparents' graves with tears streaming down her face and spoke to the assembled crowd. "I was 7 years old when Grandma Katherine died, and I remember her so clearly. She had the kindest eyes and the gentlest hands, and she could make anything beautiful, whether it was a dress or a garden or just an ordinary day. She would tell me stories about walking from Santa Fe, about being so scared and so determined at the same time. And she would tell me about how Grandpa Kieran appeared like an angel at just the right moment." Martha's voice strengthened. "But the best story she told me was about their last sunset together before she died. She said they sat on the porch, holding hands just like they had 1,000 times before, and Grandpa said to her, 'If I had to do it all again, I'd still ride by the edge of town that evening. Finding you was the best thing I ever did.' And Grandma said back to him, 'And walking to Piñon was the best decision I ever made, because it brought me to you.'" She smiled through her tears. "That's what they gave all of us: the knowledge that love is real, that it's worth fighting for, and that one moment of courage or kindness can change everything. They weren't perfect people. Life wasn't always easy for them. But they loved each other with everything they had, and that love created all of this." She gestured at the crowd, at the ranch, at the land stretching out around them. "We are all here because a woman had the courage to walk 60 miles toward hope, and because a man had the compassion to stop and help a stranger. We are all here because they chose each other, every single day, for the rest of their lives." The crowd was silent for a moment, then burst into applause. Young and old, they understood what Martha was saying. They understood that Kieran and Katherine's love story wasn't just history. It was a living legacy, passed down through generations, informing how they loved their own spouses, raised their own children, treated strangers in need. As the sun set over the Dalton Ranch that evening, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, the family gathered for a final toast. Someone had brought out 2 old photographs, one of Katherine on her wedding day, beautiful and radiant in her ivory silk dress, and one of Kieran on the ranch, weathered and strong, his eyes kind despite the hardness of the land. "To Katherine and Kieran," said Kenneth's great-grandson, raising his glass. "May we all love as deeply and live as fully as they did." "To Katherine and Kieran," everyone echoed, and the words carried across the land that had been their home, their refuge, their legacy. And if you had been standing on that hill by their graves at just the right moment, with the sun setting and the wind blowing gently through the grass, you might have imagined you saw two figures standing hand in hand, watching over the family they had created, the land they had tamed, the love they had built from nothing but courage and compassion and unwavering devotion. You might have heard a woman's voice saying, "I wasn't sure I'd make it here," and a man's voice responding, "But you did. You made it. And I'll always be glad I was here when you arrived." The Dalton Ranch stood for generations more, weathering the changes of time but never forgetting the two people who had started it all. Their story was told and retold, adapted and embellished, but at its core it remained simple and true. A desperate woman walking toward hope, a kind man who stopped to help, and a love that proved stronger than hardship, longer than life, and eternal as the New Mexico sky. In the early days of the 21st century, one of Katherine and Kieran's great-great-great-granddaughters stood at their graves doing research for a college history project. She read the simple inscriptions on their headstones and thought about how different the world was now from the one they had known. She lived in a time of instant communication, easy travel, and social safety nets that would have seemed like miracles to her ancestors. But as she stood there in the fading light, she realized that some things never changed. People still needed courage to face uncertain futures. People still needed kindness in times of desperation. And people still needed love, real love, the kind that chose commitment over convenience and perseverance over giving up. She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the graves to include in her paper, but before she left, she did something that surprised herself. She knelt down and touched the ground between the two headstones. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for finding each other. Thank you for building something that lasted." The wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwoods that still grew along the Pecos River, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. And in that moment, the young woman felt connected to her ancestors in a way she never had before. She understood that she carried their DNA, yes, but more importantly, she carried their legacy. She carried the knowledge that love was real and courage mattered and kindness could change the course of history. She stood and walked back to her car, carrying with her the story of Katherine and Kieran, ready to tell it one more time, to keep it alive for one more generation. Because some stories deserve to be told forever. Some love deserves to be remembered. And some legacies deserve to endure as long as the land itself. Back in 1878, when Kieran Dalton found Katherine Foster at the edge of Piñon, neither of them could have imagined where that meeting would lead. They couldn't have foreseen the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who would carry their names and their values forward through time. They couldn't have known that their simple love story would become a legend, told and retold across generations. All they knew in that moment was that they had found each other. A woman who wasn't sure she would make it had made it. A man who believed in helping those in need had done exactly that. And from that single moment of connection, everything else had followed. A courtship, a marriage, a family, a ranch, a legacy that would outlive them by generations. It was, in the end, a simple story. But the best stories often are. A stranger in need. A hand extended in kindness. A love that grew from gratitude and respect into something deep and lasting and true. A life built together, one day at a time, through hardship and joy. until death parted them and then reunited them in whatever comes after. The sun set over Piñon, New Mexico, just as it had every evening for thousands of years before Kieran and Katherine arrived, and as it would for thousands of years after their story ended. But for a brief, beautiful span of decades, two people had lived and loved on that land, and their love had mattered. It had changed lives. It had created a family. It had left the world better than they found it. And really, what more could anyone ask from a life than that?